All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to
Tuesday.
Wednesday.
Oh,
Wednesday. Big surprise. So, sorry about the late start here. We were just waiting for a few people to come in, and we're not quite at full capacity yet, but maybe we will be soon. Um, I'll say a quick good morning here to Unadi. So, good morning, Unadi. Sartaj, good morning. Jesse, good morning to you. And Alicia, good morning to you. So, today, there we go. Today we start talking about racism, right? And racism is kind of probably the most popular topic of this course. And popular, I mean popular in that lots of people out in society are talking about this. Um, but there's a reason why we didn't sort of jump into it at the beginning, right? Because I felt that there was a lot of stuff that we needed to learn to talk about first before we get into the thing that everyone is talking about, right? Because again, there's lots of misconceptions, there's lots of misunderstandings, there's lots of people who don't kind of understand how socialization and social justice works. They don't understand how race works. And on top of that, people are very kind of, how do I phrase this? They really don't want to be seen as racist, right? So people will be very, very careful about what they say. And lots of people won't say anything at all because they're afraid of, being branded as a racist and everybody kind of jumping on top of them and beating them up kind of thing, right? On social media, not for real. So it's kind of it's a very kind of emotionally reactive topic. There's lots of people discussing it. And so again, I didn't want to start with it because there's stuff that we needed to know first. But I think we're in a place now where we can talk about this. So I'll start out with a few questions for you. So a few questions I have for you. So what is race? What race are you? And who gets to say what race you are? Can you change races? Is race meaningful? Why or why not? Okay. So maybe I'll start and I'll ask you the first question. How would you explain race to me if I was an alien who had no idea what race was? What would you tell me? It's clearly a thing. Racism is a thing. People get very upset about racism. What is race?
I mean, it's a part of physical appearance.
Part of physical appearance. Okay, good.
I guess it's where our ancestors are from, so where we originate. I don't know how you say it.
Heritage.
Okay, yeah. So it has to do with our heritage, right? With
Yeah.
where our ancestors come from. Very true. What else is it? What else is race? You're very right. It has to do with ancestors and heritage. Has to do with where we come from. Has to do with our physical appearance. Very good.
That's all I can think of.
Not so easy, hey? Not so easy to define. Well, okay, let me ask you the second question. Do you know what race you are? If somebody asked you, what race are you, what would you tell them?
So why are you asking?
Okay, but what if you felt that you needed to answer it for some reason?
I mean, white Caucasian.
Yeah, you're white Caucasian, right?
Okay.
Eunice, what would you say that you were? You're Chinese?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, most of us kind of have some kind of answer, right? For some of us, it might be a little more complicated, right? We might be of a mixed race, right? And so we might have to, depending on how we appear or how we might want to present ourselves to society, we might say one thing or the other. who gets to say what race you are?
Ourselves.
You do? Peter? You?
I don't know, maybe some like how can I say, like governmental structures that are, you know, working with documents maybe, and
Oh,
they need this information
yeah.
just
Oh.
like to show.
Right? So you might get to say what race you are, but there also might be some sort of like official government aspect to this, right? Because sometimes your race is that information is collected in certain places, right? In certain areas. So on the census, for instance, sometimes it's asked what your race is, right? Anyone else get to say?
I'm not sure. I don't really think so. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's because like it's hard to say, but if others like I don't think it's really necessary for them to like say what race we are unless we voluntarily say it.
Right.
And there's those like people out there, like I've seen videos on the internet. They're like, "What Asian are you?" or like what. I find that pretty rude.
Yeah, like trying to determine like
Yeah.
what Southeast Asian country
Yeah.
people are from.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like people from Southeast Asia can usually kind of point out who's who. I don't think I
Yeah.
understand the sort of ethnic and cultural dynamics enough to do that. But yeah, that's true. What about this one? Can you change races? Can't? Can't?
I mean, it's like changing your age or changing your height.
Okay, so it's something that it just you just are that thing, right? So just like Peter says, just like your height, or just like your sorry, what else did you say?
I mean, I said age, but I mean,
Oh.
like, not that, like, of course you're growing your ages,
Yeah.
but you cannot, like, be, let's say, 15 and say, oh, I'm 14.
Yeah, you can't choose your own age. You can't say, yeah, if so, I'd be 29, right? But yeah, you can't choose your own age. You can't just tell people what height you are if you're not that height. And similarly, you can't change races. You just are what you are, right? Maybe. What about this last question here? Is race meaningful? Is it significant? Is it important?
I mean, in my country, it's not.
In your country, it's not? Why not?
Well, first of all, we don't have a lot of different races.
Very true.
And second of all, like, it's not that we have any laws or like people, you know, or like. I mean, of course, there are some people who are like racist or something, but then many of them are just neutral. They don't care.
Right. So it's kind of so in your country it's not it's kind of just not really on people's radar, right? People aren't talking about it.
They have bigger problems than that.
They yeah they do. Sorry, but yeah. So it's just it's not really a topic of conversation. People have other things occupying their attention, right? Okay. What do you think, Eunice?
I think it is meaningful, but in my country, it's like on the surface, it's not really talked about, but like on the inside, like what because my country there's like a mix like of the locals and some are mostly Chinese. The rest are like locals. Like I don't know how to describe it, but like the Chinese and the locals like look totally different. But
Okay.
it's
So like the original Indonesians.
somehow I guess, and
Wha-
it's like we're not racist, but
But there's a divide between those two groups.
there's a huge difference. Like
What's the difference between sort of the sort of non-Chinese Indonesians and the Chinese Indonesians?
I'm not too sure, but I think some of the locals like they're like, oh, the Chinese ones are like rich. They're all rich and stuff. Well,
Okay.
not everyone is, and like
So there's some stereotypes about
yeah,
about Chinese Indonesians.
yes,
Are they? Is there kind of like a class difference? Is it like are the wealthiest people or the wealthier people in Indonesia, are they more likely to be Chinese?
I don't mean to be racist, but most of the wealthy people are.
Yeah.
But there's also like
And that's not racist. I mean, if it's most of the wealthiest people in the United States and Canada are white people. That's just a fact, right?
Yeah.
That's not racist. It's just fact.
But then again, there's also like people who are locals and they're also very rich.
Right. So it's not a pure kind of division that way, but there's some truth to the stereotype, but not
Yeah.
not everyone, of course. Okay, so in what ways is race not meaningful? In what ways is it not important?
So I don't
Or,
know how to
or what
answer.
would you say if it was a yes or no question and I said, is race meaningful, yes or no? What would you say?
Maybe more to the yes.
More to the yes?
I don't know. In my view, it's meaningless.
Okay. So from your perspective,
Yeah.
it's not a meaningful thing,
Like
right?
for me.
Okay. Eunice leaning towards maybe
Yes.
yes. Okay. All right. Well, that's a good place to start. That's a good place to start. Um, so yeah, and I will point out, I'm not trying to single you out,
Yeah.
Eunice, but one of the things that people are kind of worried about is that if they call attention to anything with regard to race, they worry that it's going to be racist, right? And in part that's an understandable feeling, right? Because again, lots of people are sensitive to this issue, and if you say the wrong thing, some people have a big reaction, and it's a lot, right? But it's interesting because there are a lot of people who feel that we shouldn't be talking about this, right? That it is a divisive thing, right? The more we talk about race, the more it divides people, and the worse things are, right? But I would disagree with that, right? I would say that, if racism is a problem, you can't fix the problem by not talking about it, right? And it might be an uncomfortable conversation sometimes. People might get upset sometimes. Some people might say the wrong thing, accidentally, and that's fine, right? But you have to have the conversation, right? You can't fix it by not talking. And so, don't worry too much about, saying something that's racist, because one of the things that I'm trying to get across to you in this course is that, we're all kind of victims of our socialization, right? We've all kind of absorbed social messages. Sometimes they affect our thinking and behavior in ways that we're not aware of. And so, sometimes you might say the wrong thing, right? Sometimes I might say the wrong thing. I hope not, because I'm live streaming my words to the entire world. Of course, nobody's watching my channel, but still, my words are out there, so hopefully I don't say the wrong thing. But it's very possible that I could, right? And so, we all have to speak out against racism and condemn it, but also like give a little bit of, a little bit of leeway to people who might accidentally say the wrong thing, right? Because this is a learning process, right? This is a conversation. It's not about, it's not about making sure you say the right thing, and if you don't, that you're clearly a horrible person and a racist, right? And unfortunately, that's the way it kind of works in social media often, but that's not helpful, right? It's not helpful to sort of, find anyone who has said anything wrong ever and then like completely cancel them and destroy their entire careers and their lives, right? Like some people deserve consequences, but we have to be able to talk about this with a little bit of space for people saying the wrong thing by accident, right? So, good place to start. Let's start here, okay? So, as I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, racism is a difficult thing to talk about, right? It's very emotionally charged at the moment. Lots has happened, going back a couple years to, in the States anyway, going back to the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and other Black Americans. So racism is very kind of a hot topic in the United States. Here in Canada, of course, we had the discovery of 215 unmarked children's graves outside of an Indian residential school in Kamloops. And so that has kind of put racism and race on our sort of things we're paying attention to right now. So there's a lot going on, right? And so, but again, it's difficult to talk about. Many people don't really know what they're talking about or don't have the appropriate kind of vocabulary to do it. And so they wind up not saying the right thing, or they wind up just saying what everyone else is saying, or they don't want to talk about it at all because they're worried that they'll say the wrong thing and it'll go badly, right? There's also there are, institutional and economic interests in upholding racism, right? So dominant groups don't like to lose power, right? Whoever the dominant group is. And so many people don't want to talk about racism because they worry it might affect them, right? Negatively. Right? And so they want to keep things the way that they are. They don't want to rock the boat too much. So let's not make a big deal about this racism stuff, right? Yeah, there's lots of ideologies floating around out there, right? Individualism, right? We're all individuals, right? We're all unique people, and we should all be treated that way, right? And again, that's true, and that's how people should be treated, but also we know that society doesn't treat everybody that way, right? Society treats you as a member of a group, right? Your gender, your age, your social or economic class, your race, your religion, your citizenship status, all of those will affect how people treat you and interact with you. They shouldn't, for the most part, but they do, right? And so, again, thinking that everyone is sort of a unique individual and that everyone will see them that way, or people who saying, "Oh, I don't see color, I don't see people as one race or the other," usually not helpful, right? They mean to be helpful, but they don't really help us talk about the issue or solve it, right? Sometimes people are emotionally attached to their ideas about racism, particularly people who, particularly white people who look like me and like to think that, they are blameless in all this, right? Like if you don't do anything racist, then you're fine, right? You're a good person. And that's pretty overly simplistic, right? And again, we'll get into this later, but, I have to understand here in Canada that I have benefited from the fact that Indigenous people have been pushed aside, right? Me and people like me have done better because Indigenous people have done worse, right? And I don't agree with that. I don't like it. I didn't do anything to make it that way, but that's the way it is, right? And so some people have they experience a lot of emotions trying to come to terms with that idea, right? Because they feel that either they're not a bad person, so they shouldn't be kind of involved in this idea, or they feel like really, really, really guilty about it. And again, we can get to that a little bit later, but yeah, some people want to believe that they are a certain type of person and that they would never do anything bad, and that might be true, but again, we are all part of society, right? We're all kind of at a different place in society and we benefit from it or are limited by it in different ways. And you don't really get to choose that, right? As a man in society, you have certain benefits that women don't have, right? And that's the way it is. You don't have to like it or agree with it or do anything to make that happen. It just is, right? And so, again, some people don't really want to believe that. They want to believe that it all comes down to their own actions, and it doesn't entirely, right? It has to do with how society works and what your kind of place is in it. And the fact that there are some very real negative effects on minoritized groups. So this is not a theoretical thing, right? And it's not just about saying mean things to people. There are some serious economic, social, educational, health effects on people in minoritized groups. Like, this makes a difference in people's lives, right? And so, yeah, it's a difficult thing to talk about, but I think we'll be able to navigate our way through it. Okay. So, the first thing we'll do is actually define race, because I asked you that, and we kind of got pieces of it, but we didn't really get the whole thing, and it was a difficult thing to define. But let's kind of separate out race from ethnicity, okay? So here, when we're talking about ethnicity, we're talking about your kind of, basically your cultural identity, right? So again, you could be any kind of race, but this kind of depends on where you're raised, what culture your family is, right? The language you speak, the history of your people, all of those things are your ethnicity, right? And sometimes they overlap with your race, right? Sometimes they're not the same, right? So ethnicity has to do with culture and language and history, okay? But race is different, and notice how it's defined here. Race is a social distinction, right? So it's a part of identity, for sure, which I think is what Peter was kind of saying, but it's also a social distinction. It's a social category, right? And it's based on also what we said is your physical appearance, right? And specifically, parts of your physical appearance that would identify you as belonging to a certain race, right? And yeah, so definitely the color of your skin is a big one, right? Sometimes it has to do with the shape of your face, shape of your eyes, how your hair grows. All of those things can indicate to people or to allow people to categorize them into one race or the other, right? So we have these physical characteristics that encourage people to put people in a box, right? Are you black? Are you Asian? Are you white? Right? Are you indigenous? We have these categories that we want to put people into, and we put them into them based on what we see, right, with our eyes. So far, so good? Okay. Now, we often think about race in terms of biology, right? And this makes sense, because the reason that you are the way you are is because of your genetics, right? Because of your DNA, right? I'm not white by accident, right? I'm white because my parents were white, right? They passed on their genetics to me. Their parents were white too, and they passed on those genetics to them, right? And so there's a biological element to this, because of course everything about our physical bodies, or most things, are genetically determined, right? And so in our DNA we have billions of base pairs, right? A bunch of little proteins, 4 little proteins chained together in that sort of double helix that you see all the time. And in there are hundreds of thousands of genes, right? And they code for everything, right? The things that we're talking about here, like skin color and eye color and hair and how your face looks, all the way down to like protein synthesis and how your body metabolizes fats and your blood type and all kinds of little tiny things, right? So everything in your body about the way it looks and the way it operates is coded for in your genes, right? Not surprising, right? We know this. Yeah. Now, when we start to talk about race as biology, something interesting kind of comes up. And so, oh yeah, so here of course are their genes. They're strung across 23 chromosomes. And again, you probably know if you have two X's, then you're a female, and if you have two Y's, you're a male. Although some people have a little bit of a mix of things, but so when we talk about races, a biologist would say you don't have race in humans, right? Because in pure biology class terms, a race is a group of organisms, okay, that are kind of distinct from the general population, right? So if we took, let's say, these crows that are flying around everywhere here, we've got crows. If we took, I don't know, 100 of them, took them way, way off the coast to a tiny little island and stuck them on an island where they couldn't fly back home here, eventually they would kind of evolve into a different race of crows, right? Because they wouldn't really be able to mix with the greater population of crows here, right? So they would have only a certain amount of genes, they would interbreed on that little island, and eventually their kind of gene profiles would be significantly different from the ones here on the mainland, right? And so eventually they would evolve into their own species of crow, but kind of a halfway point on that is that they're a race, right? They're a different race of crow. They have a different selection of genes. They could probably still interbreed with the main population, but they're kind of on their way to becoming a different species. But that's not true of humans really in any way. First of all, humans have never really been isolated from each other, right? Good morning. We've always moved around and migrated and bumped into other populations. We've been trading with each other. Nobody's in my comparative cultures class here, but as we found in comparative cultures, people have been trading with each other across thousands of kilometers for thousands of years, right? There's almost no humans that have been totally isolated from each other. And because of that, humans are, genetically speaking, very similar to each other, okay? Very, very similar. To the point where, let's see, who can I pick? I'm going to pick Tom, okay? So Tom and I are both white men, yes? I assume that Tom has European ancestry, okay? Not positive about that, but I think he does. I definitely do. I know that my genes come from kind of Northern Europe, the UK and Scandinavia and stuff like that, because I did 23andMe and that's what they told me. So Tom and I, both of our genes come from the same part of the world. And so you would think that we would have kind of similar genetic profiles, right? He's definitely the same race as me. Now Eunice, I'm sorry, I'm going to use you as an example here. So Eunice, of course, your genes come from a completely different part of the world, right? They come from China originally?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably. So historically speaking, Eunice's ancestors come from China. Her genes have been inherited from generations and generations in a completely different part of the world than me and Tom, correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Now, what's interesting is that if we sequenced all three of our DNA, me, Tom, and Eunice, what we might find is that Eunice might be more similar to me than I am to Tom. Or vice versa. She might be more similar to Tom than Tom is to me. And that seems odd, right? Because Tom is, it seems like he's more likely to be like me. He's white, and his ancestors come from roughly the same part of the world, right? Your genes come from a totally different part. But that's the thing, is that humans aren't that genetically variable. there are a few genes that we inherit from our ancestors that have to do with our appearance, right? So our skin color, hair, face shape, sometimes eye shape, right? Those are genes that are passed on. But there's just not that many of them, right? Humans have hundreds of thousands of genes, right? We have a really long DNA strand. And really, when you look at the genes that code for things that help us divide people into races, there's just not that many genes, you know? There's a few for skin color. There's a few that, code for face shape or things like that. But really, like you're looking at literally a handful of genes out of hundreds of thousands. And so even though, we might look at, me, and then you might look at a black person, and you might say, wow, those people look completely different. On a genetic level, we're really just not that different. In genetic terms, we are basically the same person, all of us. Even though, because we're such visual creatures, right, we're animals that really understand our world through our eyes, right? We don't sniff things like dogs, right? We look at things. Because we understand our world through our eyes see a black person and a white person, and we say, wow, big difference, right? Wow, look at that. That's a big difference between those people. But again, if you compare their genetic sequences, it's just not that different. We're really not that different. And again, Eunice, you might be more genetically similar to me than another white person is similar to me. Maybe not, but maybe, right? So, yeah, a biologist would say that, yeah, we don't really have any human races, right? Humans have been, interacting with each other and interbreeding with each other for basically our entire history, right? And so there's no this race or that race or this genetic group and that genetic group. We've kind of all mixed our genes together into one pool, right? Which, in social justice terms is kind of nice to hear, right? Like, I don't know, I think it's kind of nice to hear that we're all pretty much the same, right? Regardless of our race or ethnicity, we are genetically the same people. Of course, when you have a novel coronavirus appear, it's actually a bad thing, right? Because really no one has immunity to it because we're all so genetically similar, right? If we were genetically different, some people might have more immunity, some people might have less. Some countries, who knows, maybe they wouldn't even need to be vaccinated, right? Because they had somehow some sort of genetic, protection from this. But as it turns out, humans are humans, right? We all have very similar genetics, and we're all affected by something like COVID in a very similar way, right? And the number of people who have gotten sick and the number of people who have died around the world is pretty much a function of government response and availability of vaccines, right? Has nothing to do with our genetics, because again, genetically speaking, we're really all the same, right? So race is a biological thing in that the differences that we identify come from biology, but really there's no difference between people of different races, right? They have a few genes that have been handed down, and for the most part those genes are adaptive. Do you know why, for instance, my skin is the color that it is?
Because of the climate where your ancestors were, it wasn't that sunny, and I think like your skin wasn't affected by it also.
Yeah, it wasn't that sunny where my ancestors come from, right? My ancestors come from the UK and from Scandinavia, right? It's cold, it's wet, it's cloudy, right? And do you know what humans need sunlight for?
Vitamin D.
Yeah, nice one. Yeah, vitamin D synthesis, right? So your skin actually needs sunlight to enter your skin in order to help synthesize vitamin D. And so if you're living in the tropics or if you're living in, Central Africa, no problem, right? You got lots of sun. And actually what you need is protection from the sun, right? So most of the people who live around the equator tend to be darker skinned, right? Because they're skin is protecting them from the intense sun, right? But people who come from my part of the world, that's not your problem, right? Your problem is you need to actually let the sun in because there's none of it, right? So my skin is almost kind of transparent, right, to allow more sunlight to enter. And so you'll see that with skin color, but also with some other racial markers too. They're kind of environmental adaptations, but they don't really, again, they just don't make a big difference between humans, right? They might seem like a big difference to us because we use our eyes so much, but genetically speaking, it's just, there's no difference, right? There's no difference between you and me, or you and me, or you and me, or any of us, right? We're all the same. Good morning. Was that the one I just had? Yeah. Yeah. So basically we share 99.9% of our DNA with other people, right? We're effectively the same person. And again, the physical differences that divide us into races, they're just not that big a deal, biologically speaking, and they're far more social constructs, right? They're socially constructed. They're not biological realities. Yeah. So the differences between us are just not that big. We're much more similar than anything, right? So, but that let's see. Yeah. So that said, so race is not a biological thing. It's not biologically meaningful, but it is socially significant, right? Because humans believe that race is a thing, right? People are discriminated against based on their race, right? And so, again, as we know with humans, anything that humans believe to be real has power, right? If people believe something to be true or believe it to be real, it almost works as if it is real, right? And so here we see race acting as if it's a biological reality, right? It seems like people are separated out, right? And it seems like some races are more rich, right, or more successful than others. And again, those might look like biological realities, but they're not, right? They're the result of social constructs. Just like Jane Elliott's class with the blue-eyed and the brown-eyed kids, right? It looked like the brown-eyed kids were smarter, but were they? No, right? They weren't smarter, they were just performing better as a result of the social environment, right? It's not a biological reality, it becomes a social one. Okay. So very quickly here, in North America and in other countries of the world too, the dominant group is white, right? White or Caucasian people are in the dominant group. The minoritized group then we often refer to, and I've used this term before, as people of color, okay? So people of color are basically anyone who is not white. And it's not a great term to use because it kind of lumps together a bunch of people who are really different, right? So, if you're in the United States and you're talking about racism, if you're a black person, you're dealing with a different kind of experience than if you're an indigenous person, right? Those are totally different things. Or let's say you're Chinese or Japanese, right? You're dealing with kind of a different experience, different stereotypes, and maybe, a different kind of dynamic. But people of color kind of lumps you all in the same category. So it's not a great term, but it's often one that we use to distinguish who has the power and who has less, right? So again, we kind of lump everyone into people of color, but keep in mind that there's a lot of different people in that group. Okay, so you want to take a little break? Okay, let's take a quick break. When we come back, I have something for you to read that will talk a little bit about racism, what it is. It'll give you some more background, and it'll set us up to talk about how race becomes a thing. Okay? So let's take a little break, and when we come back, we'll deal with that, okay? Okay, and we are back. So, to review for you quickly, we've been talking about race and what it is, and we've said it's a social distinction based on people's appearance, right? And so, some of these some of these kind of elements of our physical appearance, like we mentioned, come to us from our ancestors. They come from certain parts of the world. But when you look at humans, kind of genetically speaking, we're really not that different, right? And the differences that mark us as, belonging to this race or that race, you're really talking about a handful of genes, right? Out of hundreds of thousands of other ones. And so, even though our eyes, think that the racial differences between us are big, in fact, they're tiny, right? They really have no effect, and we're, you know, genetically the same person, right? And again, the COVID pandemic has done a good job of proving just that, right? That all humans are equally susceptible to COVID, whether, wherever in the world you come from, right? Everyone is equally susceptible. So, what I would like to do is ask you to read this article, okay? And so, as you can see, it's called Understanding Racism, and let me just open it up here for myself. There it is. It's actually written from a bit of an indigenous perspective. And so we'll hear a little more about indigenous people and racism and so on a bit later. But that's where this article is kind of written from, okay? So I asked for you to read it and answer the questions, but I just see that, where are my questions for this?
You're scrolling from Teams?
The article itself is in Teams. Maybe I have the questions in my, are they here? Good. These are the questions, but I'll put the questions into Microsoft Teams just in the main sort of chat, just so we have them. So I'll let you start reading that article and answering the questions, and I'll check in with you in a little bit to see how it's going and where we are, okay? Yeah, that's what we'll do. So I'll let you start reading. I'll put these questions into Microsoft Teams, and we'll be good to go. There we go. There we go. The name of the article, it says FS, and then it says Understanding Racism. So, do you see it there? Yeah, you got it? Okay, good.
tired of it?
Yes, but
Or
I'll stop you maybe after 15 minutes or so, and we'll just kind of talk about what we've read, okay?
or
But if you have questions about things as you read, let me know, okay? Okay, good people. So I know you're still reading, and I know it's a bit of a difficult, it's a challenging article for us. I know that as well. Are there any kind of words or concepts or things that have come up that you want to ask about that would help you to understand better? Or we can talk about those as they come up, maybe. But let me ask you this first question, if I can. When and why does race, as a category, when does it emerge? When does it appear first? Yeah, very interesting, right? So race isn't something that people have been talking about for thousands of years, right? In fact, it has to do with colonization, right? And the British trying to categorize these people that they're encountering and enslaving, basically, right? Why else does this concept of race appear?
Then there are some differences in some views.
There's some differences in
Views. In views, in different views.
different peers,
Different views, like the group of people.
right?
So when you see some differences, they will just group them in one race and the other race together.
True, true, right? So, yeah, when we have people who are different, sometimes we may categorize them for sure. But yeah, so the British are kind of colonizing various places around the world. They are encountering people who look different from them, right? And so they're attempting to describe them. But what else does this concept of race allow them to do? To what? To identify, yes. But then what else after they've identified them?
Like to be superior.
Yeah, right. A lot of these ideas of race are not simply that, oh, there are different groups of people, right? Or there are different kinds of people, but it puts people in a hierarchy, right? Of who is better, right? Who is more culturally developed, who's more intellectual, who's more, virtuous or hardworking or whatever kind of measure of people you want to use. It rank orders people according to their race, right? And of course, white people, British people were put at the top, right, as being the best, and then other races were less than, right? They were less than the British were. And what did that kind of allow the British to do? Not just the British, but what did it allow the colonizers to do?
To make their own rules to oppress
Yeah.
people of other races.
Yeah, to basically, yeah, to make their own rules and to oppress people, right? So if I'm gonna go into your house and, just walk right into your house and eat the food out of your fridge and sit on your couch and watch your TV without your permission, there has to be a reason for that, right? There has to be a reason for it. And again, the colonizers kind of needed a reason for, why was it okay for them to go into someone else's land and claim it for their own and take the resources and enslave the people and treat them horribly? Why was that okay? Oh, it's okay because they're less than us, right? They're not as human as us, right? They're not as sophisticated, right, or intelligent, right? They're a bunch of savages, or they're a bunch of, whatever. Yeah, so it helped to identify people and categorize people, but it also was a justification, right? It justified colonizers' mistreatment of people around the world, right? And so they created this kind of hierarchy where they were at the top and everyone else was less, right? maybe if they worked really hard, maybe they could become as good as the colonizers. But in the meantime, the colonizers would be, would kind of do what they want, right? They would kind of make their own rules. Even to the point where colonizers not only justified what they were doing through this racial ideology, but they also felt like they were actually doing a good thing, right? There was this thing called the white man's burden, right? The idea that, white people were so civilized and so advanced that they actually had a responsibility to go around the world and bring other places, other people to the same level. So they were civilizing the rest of the world, right? And so not only were they using it as an excuse to treat people horribly, but they also were able to kind of like pat themselves on the back for doing it, right? Like we're doing a good thing here. We're civilizing these poor, savage, people who are less than us, right? We're giving them something. We're giving them civilization, which is bonkers, right? But again, that's what the ideology was, right? So this kind of idea of race comes out of a period where you need an excuse to treat people badly, right? And what's the excuse? Well, they're different, right? They are less than us. They're not as good. And again, after a while, the idea becomes, oh, well, we're doing an honorable thing here, civilizing the world that is not civilized, right? So they give us here kind of an official ideology of race. Can you just kind of walk me through that, this official ideology of race? No? Actually, let me just see. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay. Yeah. So this is the part where they start talking about science, right? Because science gets in on this idea as well, right? Because just as we saw with women's suffrage, other social institutions will kind of support each other, right? So the government was out there colonizing other nations and taking them over, and of course, science kind of stepped up to explain and support this, right? So scientists actually created an ideology of race that supported what the government was doing. And what is it here? What do they say? It says scientists became increasingly interested in looking for differences between groups who were now defined as separate races. This produced an ideology of race. So it says, according to this ideology, racial categories are exclusive, right? So you're either one thing or the other thing, right? You're one race or the other race. You can't be both. That they arise from nature, right? So this idea that there are different races is a natural biological reality, and that they're enduring, right? So if you belong to a certain race and they feel that a certain race is this way, you will always be that way, right? You will always be a member of that race, and you will act or be the way that they saw those races, right? Let's see. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it there for now, because this is a complicated article. We're going to need to go back to it tomorrow, so I don't want to burn us out today. So maybe I'll just leave it there, and I will see you back here tomorrow, if that's cool. Cool? Not cool? Cool? Okay. All right. So that is all for today then. You can pack it up, and I'll see you tomorrow where we'll have Thursday.